on the phone national correspondent for theweek.com, Ryan Cooper, on his piece, How Your Local Jail Has Become Hell. Welcome to the program, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start where you start with Sierra Zern. I mean, let me ask you first, what made you want to dive into jails as opposed to, I guess, prisons?
Well, on one level, it seems that, to me, my perception is that not very many people pay attention to jails, that prisons get a lot of media attention, a lot of pop culture attention, movies like American History X and, various, there was a great report in the New York Times about Attica in New York, and another one about the maximum security prison in Colorado, federal prison. But jails just sort of fly under the radar because there's so many of them. But another reason was just that a friend of mine a while ago went to jail for about a little over a week and came back saying that, oh man, you don't know how bad it is in there. And nobody pays attention to these problems. And so, I was kind of motivated. This has been quite a while ago. I was working on the story for a while, but I think that's a true perception on my friend's part.
Yeah. So that people are clear, just tell people what the sort of the technical difference is between jail and prison. I think most people know, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, they are sort of used interchangeably a lot of times. But so jails are your local, they're usually county or city level institutions. They're mostly for holding people who have just been arrested or for people who are waiting to get out on bail, whereas prisons are operated by the state or the federal government, and they're usually for people who have been convicted of like more serious crimes, your felonies and whatnot. Though there are a lot of substantial number of people in jail who are doing time for like misdemeanors and stuff, usually minor offenses. But that's sort of the breakdown. That jail's kind of the entry point to the whole rest of the prison system. And they're
what is the
usually pretty small.
So what is the average? Before we get into this, because I want to start with that story of Sierra Zern, because I think in some way, obviously you felt it was exemplar in some way, but what is the average? Give us a sense of how long is the average person in jail versus the average person in prison, if you know.
I don't. I actually looked for that number in particular. I don't think that it's that anybody has figured that out, but it is pretty short. Usually, I think just a few days or a few weeks. And there are a lot of people that who are arrested many times, over the course of a year and end up, just cycling in and out of jail over and over again. But yeah, I don't think I could tell you, I would say probably the breakdown is something like 6 months. People are in jail or are usually in there for less than that. People who are in prison are usually in there for longer than that. But, I couldn't quote definite statistics.
It's interesting because in some ways, I think that is the absence of those type of statistics, particularly in terms of jails, is also an illustration of just how, I guess, how non-systematized it is, which it seems to me a lot of these problems that you investigate in your piece emanate from. There's just a lack of sort of broader oversight.
Yeah, exactly. It's what a lot of the experts I interviewed said that, prisons have a terrible and well-deserved bad reputation in the United States, but there's actually some professionalism, writ large across the whole system. There are a lot of nonprofits that pay attention to, the big prisons, and there are a lot of sort of state commissions and government agencies that are charged with keeping track of this stuff. But there's nobody who's just in charge of the whole jail thing, even on a state level. And so, it just depends on the whims of the local community, and 99 times out of 100, they just don't care. It's just like a expensive thing that nobody ever really thinks about very much. And it's just the people who are in there are just kind of non-persons to the community.
People should just let that sink in for a moment, because at the end of the day, it's the idea that it's just up to the whims of the community, and most people don't even contemplate the jail in their community. So who knows, basically, who's in charge of the conditions in that situation. All right, so tell us, Sierra Zern, her experience in jail. Why did she go to jail? What did she do? How long was she there?
So she was arrested in Southern California in the town of, I believe it's called Hawthorne. It's just one of the suburbs, it's near Compton and El Segundo. She was arrested by the El Segundo Police Department, and they found some marijuana, according to the arrest report, found like 7 grams of marijuana in her car. And they decided they were gonna accuse her of transportation of marijuana, which, it's one of those weird laws in California that's sort of written gives quite a lot of leeway to the, arresting officer. So you could just say like it's possession and you get like $100 ticket and a misdemeanor, but they said, nope, we think you're going to transport it for sale, and that's up to 4 years in jail, the charge. But anyway, so she's arrested and taken to the Century Regional Detention Facility, which is a women's only jail as part of the LA County jail system, which is, as an aside, the LA County jail system is huge. It's bigger than a lot of state prison systems. Like there's so many people in LA County. But anyway, so she's in there for basically 2 days, and she was a prescribed Paxil for major depression, and hadn't had a dose since the day before she was arrested. And so when she got to jail, she started withdrawing from that drug. And the withdrawals on Paxil, it's like one of the biggest rules of those things is you don't jump off of them.
Cold turkey.
That's very dangerous. You can cause suicidal ideation and all sorts of other paranoia delusions. So she's sort of having a breakdown, and so they throw her in solitary confinement by her account, without even any toilet paper in the cell. And she's in there for 2 days, wasn't eating anything. After 2 days, they let her out, on bail maybe, the accounts differ. But anyway, she got out after 2 days, and, just like completely haywire, just having delusions and paranoia, and went later through a trial process that took over a year to finally sort out, one of which involved the arresting officer failing to obey a court order to appear. They actually put a body attachment on him, which is sort of like a warrant, but not as stringent. He didn't show up twice, and but then they eventually just decided they're going to dismiss the whole case, and so she never even got convicted of anything. But and said it was to top it all off, when she got out. This was July of 2013. It was her birthday, like the 2 worst days of her life, she said.
And it, of course, had caused her, I guess, a lot of mental duress, never convicted of of anything. All right, so talk about how her experience is indicative. Let's start with the percentage of people in jails, and I'm aware of this in the context of prisons, and I guess it makes sense that it's also within the context of jails, but the percentage of people in jails who have some form of mental illness.
Yeah, something like 64%, I think, according to a 2006 study from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which actually does pretty good work. They have a lot of good stuff in there. But yeah, some kind of mental illness, over 60%, and that includes stuff like, addictions, from, up to schizophrenia. And I think about 20%, they said, have a serious mental illness like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or major depression. And since most of the state psychiatric hospitals were closed as part of the deinstitutionalization movement, that's where a lot of those people went. Seriously mentally ill just ended up in jail because there's nowhere else for them to go. People who can't hold jobs, who don't have any money, just can't take care of themselves, end up in there.
I mean, that's, again, it's just another thing that, people just absorb for a moment and how twisted that is. If you had said to me that, a third world country with a brutal dictatorship, what they just regularly did is they just housed all their mentally ill in prison or jail, I would say, well, that makes sense to me. I mean, that's the sort of the notion that we have in our heads of that. So Zern is her experience is reflected in terms of the mental illness issue in American jails, and then of course this notion of you're jailed even though you haven't been convicted of a crime. The reasons why you get stuck in jail, too, not just placed in there initially, but stay in there regardless of, is a function of just how much money you have.
Yeah, that's true. And things have changed quite a bit from 20, 30 years ago when, bail was, people would make a genuine effort because there's a Supreme Court ruling in 1983 that says you can't put people in jail because you can't take people off probation because they don't have enough money. And there were laws, before that time saying, trying to, work with people and make sure that they're not, you're not just locking people up because they can't afford the bail. But that's been pretty much overthrown. And I think the majority of people who end up, like the vast majority of people who end up staying in jail for their entire pretrial period, sometimes which is much longer than they're actually sentenced for, are people who can't raise the money, which is a lot. Sometimes you're talking about $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, depending on the crime that they're accused of. And, the ironic thing is that the Vera Institute of Justice people, they've done some studies on what actually causes people to either reoffend or skip bail, run out of town, which are the things that, ostensibly you're worried about. And actually the amount of bail doesn't matter. It's like things like attachment to the community, if people have kids or a wife or a husband or something like that, those are the factors that really determine whether somebody is going to show up to the trial like they're supposed to. The bail can actually backfire because then you'll end up freeing people if they just happen to have, enough money. So it's just a really cruel and inefficient system to be, relying on making people show up.
How much is bail abused in terms of just sort of enriching, because there's a business around it? I mean, what is, or is it just simply these arcane notions of not understanding what constitutes a flight risk?
Yeah, on one level, yes. Well, because you have the whole bail bondsman business, and they take a big cut. I would say the bigger problem with regards to people making money is with probation. And if you look into the private probation companies, a lot of times when people are out, and they're doing their probation time after they've gotten out of jail or prison, then they'll have these private companies that they'll operate the whole probation system for free for the government, but then they just run that by just punishing sort of fees on all of these probationers. And even though that's illegal per that Supreme Court decision I mentioned earlier, a lot of times people have ended up back in jail because they can't afford to pay the private company all the fines that they stack up, you know. And then when you can't afford it, you know, because it's like penalty fees and all of this stuff just adds up, and, you know, people end up just, you know, in one case, literally, you know, it's taking money out of their kid's backpack to try and pay these guys off. But yeah, I mean, the
How is that though? I mean, how did that happen? And I've seen, you know, I've seen other reports about this, about how sort of the, I mean, recently where I've seen reports where people talk about, I got ticketed for $200. I didn't have the money for that, and I've been now paying off. I've paid over $2,000 to pay off this $200 fine, and none of that fine's been reduced because it's all been penalties. Because I've been late with these fees. How is it that you mentioned the Supreme Court case that basically resolved that we're not going to have debtors' prisons? How is it that this takes place despite that? And talk also about the Bail Reform Act of 1984, how that law apparently seems to have gone completely upside down.
Yeah, the Bail Reform Act is just, so to start with that's part of Reagan's escalation of the war on crime and the war on drugs, and that just made it a lot easier to detain somebody before trial. The private probation companies, that's just kind of like the end state logic of kind of, you know, privatization of all of the state functions, you know. And this is just the one where it just makes absolutely the least sense, you know, of any sort of you know, function, where if you're privatizing, you know, some kind of like the DMV or something like that, you might have Forest Service that's really expensive, but you know, in the jail system and the rest of the criminal justice system, the courts and whatnot, you know, these people can't. There's no market there to choose from anything. There's no sort of legal recourse in a lot of these cases, even though, you know, theoretically this is just like flagrantly unconstitutional because, you know, they're poor, and if you don't, you know, it's very hard for someone who doesn't have any resources to mount these sort of civil rights cases, and they take forever. And, you know, it ends up being like a whole bunch of them get together with the ACLU or something, and that's when they, you know, put these suits together, which are going forward in a lot of jurisdictions. But so I think my picture of it is just, you know, if you're just outsourcing the entire government apparatus to these sort of, you know, connected private companies, then and they're dealing with people who, you know, they're unpopular, you know, maybe they're even violent criminals, and they don't have any sort of money or political influence or like, you know, power of any kind. Even they can't vote in a lot of jurisdictions, then it's just going to be flagrant abuse, you know, just taking them for everything they can get. And you know, if you want to protect if you want to, you know, a constitutional detention, you have to build a system that keeps that in mind at all times. Private companies don't care about that. It's money, you know.
What's driving the privatization of these probation companies? I mean, I know the story behind the privatization of jails. Ostensibly, it's going to save money, but it never does. What is it? It is similar dynamic with probation?
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, right, you have the logic of austerity. You know, it's like you have these local governments under real budget pressure, you know, and they're usually conservative states that are doing this kind of stuff, and so they really can't raise taxes. And I think it does save money. I haven't looked at this sort of systematically, but I know that when it first starts out, I think this is a real relief for a lot of these institutions, because they're not charging the government at all to run the actual probation system. But when it comes to 5 years down the road, then there's all these civil rights suits start rolling in,
Right.
and then that becomes very expensive. And so I think it's short-sightedness, and it's and like even when it doesn't pay off, it also interacts with, I think, some of the like lingering attitude towards the criminal class, for lack of a better word. It's just like, these are garbage people. They just don't matter. They don't deserve any sort of protection or constitutional rights, and just blindly punitive kind of smashing them. And if they're getting just completely abused, it doesn't matter, because they shouldn't have committed those crimes.
Yeah, and it's you call it. I guess it's called offender-funded justice from these. I guess these probation companies, right? It's just an unbelievable scam, and of course, there's no constituency. I mean, I guess there's no. I should say this constituency, which is not a static constituency, right? I mean, there's a lot of, when we talk about, well, give us the numbers in terms of how many people are in jail. And when we say how many people are in jail, it's really like people move in and out of jail, obviously, with a lot more frequency, and not even the same people, but people in general than we see in prisons.
Yeah, so there are about 730,000 people in jails, as compared to about 1.3 million in state prisons and about 210,000 in federal prisons, if I remember correctly. But as you said, yes, there's enormous churn in the jail system. There are about 12 million admissions every year throughout jails. And I think people have tried to figure out exactly how many of those represent readmissions, and I don't think that those numbers exist, but probably quite a lot. But it's safe to say that both a lot of people are going to jail multiple times during the year, and a whole lot of people are also, just being washed in and out of the system. But yeah, it's tremendous churn. This affects a substantial portion of the population.
So talk about like what a reform would look like. I mean, the prison, I guess, reform, and I don't. I mean, well, let me ask you this before we talk about what reform would look like. It seems to me that to the extent that there is any trans-ideological policy fixes that are on the horizon, prison reform and I guess our whole sort of legal, our criminal system seems to be pretty ripe for reform, because there's a lot of, I think, like actual serious thought happening both on the left and the right. In fact, I mean, whatever. I don't want to editorialize too much on this, but it's one of the only areas where I think there's any type of serious policy reform happening on the right. Does that include jails, or is that sort of like because there's no national system of jails, there's no national data for jails, there's not as many national solutions for jails?
Yeah, that's broadly correct for the most part. And that's what, this one expert who studies jail says that ought to be, just that question itself ought to be on the list of possible changes to the jail system, is that there's no inherent reason that these need to be run as local institutions. They could be run on the state level too, or even the federal level if you wanted. The local institutions are just not, local communities are not ideal to be running these sort of places. They're often really cheap. They don't have the kind of expertise. They're not professionalized at all. But I mean, that would be a pretty substantial reform. Just getting it on people's radar would be a pretty stiff uphill battle. And that's, I think, there definitely does seem to be, as far as I can tell, some real sort of bipartisan impetus. The politics of crime have totally changed, like to a degree that's kind of surprising to think about, in terms of like 20, 30 years ago, to where people are willing to say, hey, we need to scale back some of these, really harsh penalties. And they're not focused on the jails at all, or as far as I can tell, really nobody's even really talking about it, because it's just not on the national menu. It's not on the sort of the discussion options. However, one of the jail system is directly connected to the rest of the prison system, and so one of the reasons that it expanded so much, back in the mid 20th century, was because there was huge demand, lots of new people coming into prison, and so jails had to scale up to deal with that, in the 70s and 80s during the war on crime. And so if you were to run that in reverse and dramatically reduce the prison population, then that would take a lot of the pressure off of jails. It wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would definitely solve some of them. Simple overcrowding, is a major issue, especially in some of the bigger jurisdictions like Harris County in Texas and the LA County jails, as we talked about before. But yeah, I mean, if I had my druthers, I would say, that you shouldn't just rely on those sort of indirect effects. It should be definitely a major part of the reform discussion, that people ought to be looking at really, that do we need to leave these things in the hands of local communities, which, often don't want them because they're really expensive.
Right.
It's often the most expensive part of the county budget. But that's tough, just getting it on people's, in front of people's eyes is a tough thing.
And so, what would you do? I mean, would that would not be addressed by the Bail Reform Act, would it? I mean, it was you write that the 1984 Bail Reform Act made it way too easy to detain people before jail. So, how would you reform that legislation?
That would be, actually, I should have mentioned that, but definitely that could help a lot by making it. You would just change the rules basically to say that.
What do the rules say now? I mean, it was supposedly a reform. What was that reform aimed at, and what did it end up doing?
Well, but in the 60s, the rule was that you could only detain people if you could prove that they were a flight risk. And this one made it so that you could detain people if you thought they were a flight risk or you thought they would reoffend. And in the hands of judges, this is kind of a thing that just developed a momentum of its own. That became, you just have to have the prosecutor say that I think this guy's going to reoffend, and then he goes, away he goes. Sort of like how, they like a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich kind of thing.
Right. Well, I mean,
but
that's the thing, I guess. The reason why and you tell me if this is correct, my assumption is to say that this guy's a flight risk, you need to establish that they have no reason to ever come back here. They have the money to go off and then live a life, that is going to be independent of where their job may have been or where their family is, et cetera, et cetera. To say they're going to reoffend is, a much easier sell because it's completely subjective and it's just a function that they've done it once. There's no reason to think they wouldn't do it again.
Right. Yeah. And I think what the way it would do that, I wouldn't necessarily change that basic framework. I would just introduce much stronger, pro poverty, not pro poverty exactly, but to say that you really have to prove, citing the research that the Vera Institute people have done, that this is actually going to be a flight risk or a risk of reoffense. Outlining some steps that you'd have to follow, and also just giving people real solid protections of some sort to say that, to give you some recourse if you can prove that you're not, in the categories of people likely to reoffend, if you have a wife and kids or something. And protections to make sure that bail is not set to an unreasonable amount too. That it should fall. You could set. I obviously don't have like a bill that I've written out myself, but set some sort of inflation-adjusted categories for various crimes, so that you can't be charged for $quintillion bail for stealing a car or something like that.
Right. And so, all right, lastly, Ryan, I mean, is there, and maybe we've already covered this, but is there, I mean, if you were to see this type of reform, based upon your going around and beating the bushes, is there any place where you have hope that it would spring from, and where would that be?
Well, the stuff that I've seen, it's definitely piecemeal. I definitely do not see in the near term any sort of like systematic look at this stuff, but I definitely do see, some positive movement here and there, and it's usually the places that are really, really bad, and then they tend to get they get either federal investigations or they get a lot of bad media coverage, and then that changes things. So in the LA County jail system, for instance, after not even this, nothing to do with, my story, but there's this bunch of deputies investigated by the federal government, by the Department of Justice for, running the LA County jail system like their own kind of feudal, torture dungeon. And 7 deputies were eventually convicted for obstruction of justice, and there are all these federal rules going through and so forth. But the end result was that after they, implemented some reforms, I think they they changed the sheriff, that the number of suicides in LA County jails fell by half.
Wow.
And suicide is a huge problem in jail. But, that's the kind of thing that seems realistic to me, in terms of, as the pressure releases, like if the prison population continues to trend downwards, and there's, more people paying attention to jail issues, I think that you could see in some jurisdictions, where the stars align, you'll see people taking, the constitutional rights of inmates more seriously, and hopefully, less abuses.
Ryan Cooper, national correspondent for theweek.com. We will link to the piece at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.